And good morning, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to another live Xanadu Gallery Art Business Academy online critique group session. Today is Wednesday, July 8th, 2020. Great to be back here with you in an online critique group session. Just a couple of quick announcements. One, I mentioned a few weeks ago that Zoom, who we use to host these meetings, is making a modification requiring that each meeting have not only a link, but also a passcode. That is becoming mandatory, I think, 2 weeks from now. So keep an eye out. Basically, nothing's going to change. You're still going to get a link from me that's going to take you to the broadcast page. But when you get there, you're going to see a link to the meeting, and next to it, you will see a passcode. We're still not sure if that passcode will have to change with each of our weekly meetings, but hopefully what you'll be able to do is just copy the passcode, click on the link, paste it in, and be good to join. Apparently, Zoom has had some problems with people sneaking into meetings they're not supposed to be in and causing all kinds of chaos. And so this passcode is supposed to help alleviate that challenge. And then also next Wednesday is an Ask Me Anything session. So the form to submit questions for that session should appear later today on the broadcast page. Be thinking of questions for discussion next week. I've got some things I want to talk about in the session, but we'll just kind of get geared up for that. Watch for an email on Monday announcing the session as well. And so with that, let's jump right into our session today and welcome our featured artist, Elizabeth Fontaine-Barr. Elizabeth, it's great to have you here in the session. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. This is very exciting, and thanks everybody for showing up. Looking forward to this.
Yes, I've received a lot of feedback and comments on the work. I'm looking forward to this discussion. But as we begin, Elizabeth, tell us a little, as we usually do, give us a little bit of background, where you're coming from, and kind of how you got into art.
Well, right now I'm in my studio. I'm in Tampa, Florida, and my studio is located in the historic section of Tampa, which is called Ybor City. It's one of the oldest areas of the city, and it kind of reminds me where I grew up was in New Orleans, Louisiana, and the architecture here is a little bit like that. It's kind of a mini French Quarter feel to it, and so there are very few art studios in the Tampa. The creative studios are across the bay in St. Pete. So I was very lucky to grab a studio here and love it. I've got, as you can see, great light, and it's just a really creative area to be in. Love it. So high impact aerobic. I mean, it was all over the place. And I didn't really get back into it until my daughter was midway through high school, and I realized I better have something to fill this, to fill this void when she goes off to college. And so I got back into my painting probably around 2008. So it was about a 35-year hiatus from doing my artwork.
And so let's go ahead and bring some artwork up and talk to us a little bit about how your style developed. Well, I'll start there. How did your style develop?
Well, mostly, even back in college, I had a very strong color palette that I loved to do. And I am more of a expressionistic and imagination painter. So I may look at something like a photograph of our travels or something like that, but then I take it off into my own imagination. So these images are basically just what start to come through as I'm painting. And the shapes and the composition can change drastically as I'm going along because I'm not looking at something to paint from. There is maybe a trigger from something, but then I put it aside because if I keep looking at what I'm the photograph or whatever, then everything gets really tight and unexpressionistic for me. And that's where my strength comes from, is the expression that I'm trying to put on canvas from inside, not from looking outside and then putting it on canvas. I don't know if that makes sense.
Oh, absolutely. And I've worked with a number of artists over the years who have done work in what, as you say, expressionistic. The term that I hear a lot, and we'll see it in some of the comments today, and I would hear it from folks in the gallery, was whimsy. That it's imagination, and that there's some playfulness because of the interplay of the colors and the shapes. Um, well, let me ask it this way: have you shown your work? How has the response been from your clientele and people who've seen it? What do you hear them saying about the work?
Yes, I have shown my work. I've had a few solo shows here in the Tampa Bay area, and I've done in group shows as well. I've had a couple of out of state acceptances into juried shows. The most that I hear is they love my color. Absolutely love my color palette. Sometimes I'll have somebody say, "Where is this?" I've also had people say, "I'd love to be in your head," because where do you come up with these images? And it is fanciful for me, and sometimes it edges on the surreal, because I don't pay any attention very much to the kind of the rules of things. So I'm more concerned with value and composition and edges and lights and darks. So I may put a shadow in the wrong place, or there's an image that just happens to appear and it doesn't make any sense. But to me, it's more about the visual composition and the balance of values rather than the realistic that's going on.
Yeah. And so, as we're always want to do, I love to start the conversation by talking about consistency, and I hope you're all catching on that I think consistency is pretty important when it comes to showing and sharing, and certainly marketing and selling and promoting your work. I think before I dive into a comment and we look at the work, I'll just go ahead and throw it out to our panel. As you were looking over Elizabeth's work, what were your impressions in terms of the consistency of the imagery? There's obviously some variety there, but do you feel that the work is tied together and recognizable? What are your impressions of the consistency? And let me throw it out to the panel. If you want to hop in with a comment on consistency, throw a hand up. And actually, I can do that to those of you who are not in the video panel as well. Let me put everybody's hand down. And if I don't get volunteers, as I'm also want to do, I'll just volunteer you and bring you into the conversation. Comments on consistency. Okay, let me go to Dolores first. She's over in the attendee panel. Good morning, Dolores. How are you?
Fine, thank you.
Good. What were your impressions as you were looking over Elizabeth's work in terms of consistency?
I like her work. It's consistent and it's very touching.
What do you mean by that? How is it touching?
I don't know. When I first saw her work, I just felt that it was there's an emotion there that's charming.
Yes. And would you have any difficulty recognizing the work as having been done by the same artist?
No, not at all.
Yeah. Okay, good. I think I saw Lori has you had your hand up as well. Lori was our featured artist a few weeks ago, so now it's your turn to give back and comment on consistency.
I thought the work looked very consistent. The color strength is really beautiful, the color she's combining. I also was intrigued by the mystery of some of the pieces. That very first one where you have the kind of rectangular shape going over the landscape that I don't know, is that in the distance or is it really close to me like an airplane wing? Just the fact that it's not totally identifiable to me. Maybe it's, a field shape, but there's that mystery that allows me to bring my own ideas to it that may not be what Elizabeth was thinking at all. But I love it when there's room for the viewer to put their own thing into that landscape. And I really like the texture of the canvas that comes through. The clouds are just lovely in this one.
Yeah, and you've both, Dolores and Lori's, kind of touched on something that I was going to comment upon, and that we experienced with the artists whose work we were showing that was, similarly loose and expressionistic, and that is that we found, just as Lori's expressing, that there's kind of an added level of engagement with a piece as you step away from realism. And that's not to denigrate artists who are working in tighter, more maybe even photorealistic styles, because those bring their own set of advantages. But this work does tend to have someone stop in front of it. If there's something there that doesn't quite square with what they were expecting, or what they would anticipate in the landscape, it raises questions and engagement, and it starts a kind of internal dialogue that can really add a lot to the experience with the work. And again, of course, as with any art, for some viewers, that level of engagement they enjoy very much. It's something that can carry them from being casually interested in the work to making a purchase and bringing the work into their collection. And of course, for other clients are going to stand in front of your work and say, "I don't get it. Why? What's going on?" And it's really going to bother them. But that it's that act of stopping and engaging with the work that I think and have experienced is often the catalyst for having some very interesting conversations about the artwork, and to being able to invite someone to go further than just casual engagement and to become a collector. And we would find that. With that looser expressionistic style, a lot of times it would lead a client to purchase multiple pieces for the interplay between the works. And maybe they'd purchase them at one time, or maybe they would be returning visits and kind of following the artist and keeping up with it. And I would suspect, Elizabeth, that you would find the same kind of thing, that the work is unique, consistent, and uniquely yours, to a level where someone who feels like they get it and they want it is probably going to ultimately become a little bit of a collector of the work, which obviously is also always a positive. And talk about that, Elizabeth. Have you found that that you get that kind of level of engagement as people are experiencing the artwork?
I have, and I've been very fortunate. I do have a few collectors out there that do seem to. I've got one who has bought so many of my small paintings, and then I've got two others, one in New York and one here in the Tampa Bay area, that have purchased quite a bit of my work because they've just fallen in love with it. And then I do have the occasional, one or two painting sales, but I do notice that people, when they start to buy, they like to have a variety of them, which is nice.
Yes,
and
it is nice.
I started this series, the one that you spoke of, Lori, with the, you did hit it on the head. That image is taken from looking out of an airplane. And so that round circular is the engine that is over the wing. And so I've been doing a series of cloud paintings from my flights, because my daughter lives out in Los Angeles, so I'm on the plane a lot. And so I've taken hundreds of photographs out of the window. And I thought, well, why not start using these? I love clouds, and that abstraction of the engine over the wing is exactly what you're seeing.
Yeah. And that's an interesting subject. I've seen an artist or two who's also used that perspective, and you're getting a unique perspective of the clouds and the shadows, and you're portraying something that a lot of people have a lot of experience with, looking out that window, and that you can tap into that experience. Edna says the bright colors and graphic shapes draw the eye immediately. I think the works you have shown us would fit very well together in a gallery setting. Your use of simplified shapes and colors comes across in all the paintings. I would have no trouble identifying them as all having been made by the same artist. But then she says, some works seem to be gallery wrap and some framed. If I were showing the pieces together, I would choose one or the other for consistency, unless you're showing pastels, which must be framed along with your acrylic. So let's talk a little bit about that. Let me, without hoping to make you dizzy here, let me hop up to some presentation images. Talk about your different formats of presentation and the different media that you're working in.
Well, basically, the majority of work that I do is on gallery wrap canvas, so I don't need to frame them. And then I also wrap the image around the side of the painting. So that really gives you a finished look up against the wall. So just about almost every gallery wrap canvas I do that, except for the really tiny ones. I used not to, but now with your advice, I've started doing all of my gallery wrap canvases have the edges painted around the side. And so with, there are some things that you'll see above, like there were other canvases that I used that were the thinner kind in the past. And so those I did frame because I didn't think that the presentation was as strong with a small edge like that. Even though I've seen that presentation a lot, I personally put a frame on it. But I tend not to frame as much as I used to. And of course I do have to frame my pastels.
Yes, and what would you say the split is between acrylics versus pastels?
I'd say 60-40 or maybe 70-30. It depends on my ability to get in the studio. Most of my pastels tend to be done when I'm away from home because that's an easy medium for me to work in. When I travel and I can bring pastels and paper and I'm trying to get some work done when I'm traveling.
Yeah, and how obviously the medium and the process is going to be different between the pastels and the acrylics, but how have they interacted with one another in terms of the development of your style and compositions?
I find it hard for me to work in pastel and keep my style because the way that I work and I change my mind so much. Pastels is not as forgiving as acrylic, obviously. I mean, and so I do work on tend to work on a sanded paper for pastel. That way I can take a stiff brush and erase as much as I can if I want to change my composition or the color or whatever it is. So pastels are definitely more challenging for me, and I have to think of the plan rather than intuitively do it. For me to not have just a mess on my hands with the pastel.
Yeah, and so it's interesting. It comes back to this conversation that we have had several times in talking about consistency, where the issue comes up. Okay, how much latitude do I have to introduce variety into my work, either in terms of my subject matter or my stylistic approach, or the medium that I'm working in. And you're going to hear me beating the drum repeatedly. Let's try and be as consistent as we can and eliminate as many variables in the consistency as we can to create a cohesive body of work. However, the stronger one element is in terms of consistency, and so in Elizabeth's case, I would say certainly the style and the palette, the values that you're using in your work are so strong that you gain, I think, some latitude to work in these two different media. And we've seen examples of both here, and it doesn't. I don't think, or at least in the pieces that I've been looking at, it does not damage the consistency of the work to have that variety in terms of media. It would certainly be, from a gallery standpoint, it would require a little bit more thought in terms of display. If I were mixing the acrylics and the pastels, I'd want to think about, how do I want to mix the two, or do I want to kind of keep them separated, group the pastels together, but it could easily be done. And I do think that, that interplay could be interesting for some of your viewers. And I suspect you're going to have some say, yeah, I can see the, even though the work is in acrylic here, I can see some of the pastel palette coming through to the acrylic pieces in terms of the contrasts and, the softness of some of the colors that are being used. And again, I think you're going to create some conversation there. Now, let's get to our favorite topic, which we always like to get into, is pricing. And Elizabeth, talk to us a little bit about the development of your pricing and what your approach is to valuing your work.
Well, a long time ago when I started, I was really concerned about how to price anything. And I noticed that it was kind of an emotional response I was having to my work about the pricing. And so I started reading successful artists and basically what they did. And they did a square inch, a price per square inch. And I jumped on that right from the get-go because I didn't know what else to do. And of course I was new and I had a very low price point. And then it increased gradually as I started to sell. But then just recently, Jason, with doing the work with you in terms of getting my digital portfolio ready and doing the 100, gallery list and all that sort of stuff, I realized my prices were still too low to even have a gallery be interested in my work. They wouldn't make very much money off me if they were selling. So I raised it. I jumped quite a bit. I mean, and you and I had a conversation, I think, a little bit back and forth about that. So those are the prices now as what I raised them to, because I was getting ready to launch. I finished everything and we took a family vacation in the beginning of February. I got back March 3rd. I was going to launch into the whole gallery, thing all over the United States.
But 2020.
But that didn't happen. So these are those updated prices, the ones that I have now. So I think those are around $225 a square inch.
Yeah, and again, it's kind of something we've had on our playlist, repeating over and over again through these conversations. Is we're constantly encouraging one another to be moving those prices up, and I don't downplay at all the challenge that can be, kind of the mental roadblock that can come up as you look at your pricing. And start thinking, well, I know logic tells me I need to raise prices. Looking around at other artists in the market tells me I need to raise prices. But as I sit down to execute that process and start bumping those prices up, it's inevitable that you're going to feel a little bit of anxiety about doing it. Shortness of breath, palpitations of the heart. And then you get it done and you get the work out there. And I suspect, Elizabeth, that even at this 225, you're going to get into some galleries and start showing the work. And pretty quickly, you're going to start feeling some feedback from the galleries saying, let's even bump things up a little bit more. Now, without getting in deeply into the sometimes mysterious mechanics of pricing, my basic recommendation is to do exactly what Elizabeth was talking about. Look around at the market, see how other artists who are in your space creating work that is in some way similar to yours, or that would have an appeal to a similar clientele, see how they're pricing their work, and analyze, see if you can reverse engineer their pricing formula so you can get kind of a starting point for pricing your work. Now, having said all that, though, that range of $1.75 on the low end to about $2.50, $2.75. I suspect as you do your research on other artists, you're going to find a lot of artists concentrated in that price point for mid-sized works. Now, there will be some variety when you get down into the smaller and into some of the larger works, but those price points tend to be pretty widely accepted in the current art market. When I started the gallery in the early 2000s, it was more $1.25 to $1.75 per square inch was kind of the broader range of the market, and you can kind of just see inflation and all of that have come into play, and now that puts us into the more $2 to $2.50 per square inch range, which is not a bad place to start. If you're struggling with pricing, certainly be looking in that range of the market to see where it would put your price points. Let's get to some, well, before I get to comments, let's just pause. We're talking about pricing. Anyone want to hop in with comments on Elizabeth's pricing, what your response to it was? Any questions about the process of pricing? Jean in the chat says, I think you can still go up more in your pricing, 2 to 3 per square inch. It'll make approaching galleries better for you in acceptance there. I mean, that kind of echoes what I'm saying, that there would be some upward price pressure, but I don't think that where you are is a bad place to start for getting out to talking to galleries. That, as long as we're not radically underpriced, as long as we're in the ballpark, it can start the conversation and get galleries going. And as a gallery owner, I am constantly looking at a range. I want to offer my clients a range of different price points. And so certainly there are going to be some galleries who are going to look at your work and feel like this could fit into our, into our value approach to showing new work to our clients. Other comments, questions on pricing? Gay says, especially smaller pieces might need to go up a little bit in pricing. Do you have a graduated approach to pricing the smaller works versus the larger works, pastels versus acrylics?
I pretty much do it by the square inch. Of course, the smaller ones you really can't, that formula doesn't really work well on tiny little things, like 5x5s or 8x8s. So I kind of move things around just a little bit. At one point I said I wasn't going to sell anything less than $100, but some of those you have to kind of fudge on all of that. It was just the way that it is for me.
Yes, never say never, right?
Right. So
okay, let's
are priced differently.
Let's go to some of the comments, and I think we're going to see in the comments about your work some reflections of what you've already mentioned in your how people respond to your work. But let's hop over. Our first comment comes from Sydney. I really enjoy your color schemes and other designs very much. You'll find collectors that love them. Keep painting. Yes, I think that we're going to see that word color come up with some frequency. Jane says, I notice on some paintings you have more interesting colors in the sky. I'd like to see more of that in the land. Also, have you ever thought of painting sky only? And I think I did see a piece either on your website or one of the pieces you had previously sent me that was kind of looking out the window and just clouds. But talk about that, in terms of thinking about landscape versus sky as your subject.
Well, yeah, and that's very recent that I've concentrated. I do have a whole series that I'm working on that's cloudscapes, the one out of the window, but then I also have red light cloudscapes. So I take photographs. Tampa has these huge storm clouds a lot. And so sitting at a red light, I'll take a bunch of photographs from my car window of the clouds. And so that's now turned into a red light cloud series. And it's really a lot of fun painting the sky. I used to be totally engrossed with trees. And so there was not a painting that didn't have trees in it for a long time. And
Historians will call that your tree period.
my tree
We're
period.
moving into
And
your
now
cloud
I'm-
period now.
Yeah, now I'm going into the cloud period. And she also says having trouble with titles. Yes.
Yes, let's jump into that. There were several comments on titles. Talk about that that challenge and that process. You know, especially where the work is as you say, coming from imagination and experience and emotion. How do you? What's your approach been to titles, and what's the challenge to titling your work?
That's one of the biggest challenges I have because I'm not painting a place, so to speak, and it is just emotion or imagination. I don't really know what to title it very well, and I do, like she said, my daughter helps me title a lot of my paintings, and so do friends. I mean, I don't have an attachment to it. It just has to kind of resonate a little bit with me, and then I'll pick that title. But as I'm watching other artists, I feel like title is really important, and I should not just be so cavalier about it. You know, like the one that we were looking at that was called Landing Here, I titled that because that painting started off as a Florida palm tree scape and ended up looking that way. And so I finally landed there, and that was the title for me. It was called, okay, I'm landing here with this painting, so I'll call it that. So, you know, I'm not quite sure what to do about finding interesting titles that are going to give it more depth to the mystery that that we're talking about. How do I do that? I'm not quite sure how to do that.
Yeah, boy, and this is another topic that's come up in a couple of our past conversations. I mentioned that I too believe that titles are important, and I want to say it carefully because I'd rather couch it as saying that a great title can have a huge impact on people's engagement with the work, can lead to sales, and you know, can be a good additional tool. Having said that, though, I've certainly have sold plenty of artwork where the title was not the you know, the decision-making point of difference, where maybe the title didn't resonate. I've had clients who have retitled artwork once they've purchased it. They feel like they came up with a better title. And so it's not that titles have to be a make or break issue. However, if you can come up with an approach to titling your work that creates added levels of engagement and interaction, it can certainly be a positive. And if you can come up with a system that makes it easier for you, so you're not struggling with the titles, that can make a big difference as well in the process. I understand it. I mean, it's one thing to say, hey, let's come up with a great title for this piece, you know, and if we work on it, we probably can do that. But when you start thinking, I have to come up with great titles for 25 pieces per year, or 50 pieces per year, or 80 pieces per year, you know, thousands of pieces over the course of my lifetime, then titles start to become a bit more daunting. So I would love to get some comments and feedback, tips and suggestions. What are you all doing when it comes to titling? What shortcuts have you found? What has been effective for you? Let me go to Kate first, and then I'll be happy to bring, I think I'm going to lower hands in the attendee group because I'm not sure which of you had hands up already and which didn't. So, but if you want to click on the hand icon again, I'll bring you in. Kate.
Okay, I find I work on the title as I'm painting. and it's a very almost intuitive kind of thing. I paint horses, and so sometimes I have some humor, like, Whiskey and Spike have lunch together or something like that. So I'm working on as I'm painting. Once in a while, it's the first thing that I do. Richard McKinley is a pastel painter, pretty realistic. And he says a lot of times his titles come first. So, which is hard if you're doing abstract, but even when I used to, your work is reminding me of what I used to do, very expressionist and color. And I think even then, the title, it was like I worked with it as long, along with a painting. So that might help you. I don't know.
Mhm.
Yeah. Let me go to Gay, and let's get another perspective on titles. Gay, if
Unmute.
you
There we
can,
go.
there we go.
Okay.
Gotcha.
All right. So I paint everything in series, even though they're standalones. So one of the things I found helpful, because the series can be identified, I have a series called Transcendental Songs, and individual paintings in that can have all sorts of titles, but at least I've led people into the series. However, what intrigued me about your description of landing was that what got hold of me was how you got there. And I had wished that you had just indicated that you didn't just fall out of the clouds and into the landing. You had a process of some kind, which I thought was very important and which was echoed in the painting itself. So that's all I'm saying. But really, I can identify, I mean, I'm doing trees right now, talk about trees. I've got trees, trees, and trees. And after a while, you're right. You think, my God, what could I call this? I just don't know.
Yeah.
But I think the process that you identified for the landing intrigued me. And I have a feeling it might intrigue other people too. So that's
Yeah.
what I do. That's enough.
Jason, I
Yeah.
do take photographs along the way,
Mhm.
and oftentimes when somebody buys a painting, I have the photographs of how it's gotten there, and sometimes it's just shocking. I started off with something totally different, and then
Excellent.
through, it gets to this,
Yeah,
and so
yeah.
a lot of people are very interested on how
Right.
that process happens, because I wouldn't be able to tell you.
Mhm.
I can only
You
photograph.
just hope that they don't say, looking at one of the photos, "Oh, I really like it when it was at this stage. Why did you ruin it?"
Yes, they do. Yes, they
That
can.
happened. That happened once. It's like,
Yes. Yeah.
wait.
I think I've got Casey. Let me see if I can get Casey in. Morning, Casey.
Hi, how are you?
Great.
Thanks for having me. For myself, as far as titling goes, and first of all, I agree. I think you need to raise your prices. I think probably we all need to raise our prices, seriously. I'll say that first off. I think those of us who work, especially representationally or, impressionist realism, to the impressionist side of abstract, usually we're trying to paint something, and most things have a story, at least if not in and of themselves, in our relationship with them. So I try to find the story behind every painting, because I think your collectors want to tap into that artistic experience of how you relate to the rest of the world. So if I'm painting a tree, I'll write something about the tree. I've got a tree that has a little bird feeder in it. It's Mary Jo's bird feeder. So there's a story behind that. Who's Mary Jo? What kind of birds is she feeding? There's a cottonwood on my property that I've painted, I can't even tell you how many times, and it's a really messy, shaggy tree. One of the titles for that was Bad Hair Day. So yeah, so that one sold like that. So I think humor, somebody said something about humor. I think that's brilliant. And I love the idea of making a connection with your collector through the story.
Yeah.
The trick is getting it short enough that it will fit on one of those little cards.
Yes. Yeah. And great points, Casey. And stories are so important. I mean, in the gallery all day long, every day, we're telling stories. Our story about it, our experiences with the artist, the stories the artists have told us about the piece. And the title is a great starting point for that story. I mentioned it when we were talking about titles a few weeks ago, that certainly steeping yourself in a little bit of poetry or music can be a good fertile nursery for coming up with some good titles. Just kind of, poets and writers, that is their craft, is finding the right words and the stories. And so getting yourself into that world a little bit can be a fertile ground for drawing from titles. And also, I'd say don't put too much pressure on yourself when it comes to titles. That's why I wanted to be a little careful and not overdo it and make you all think that you have to be the Ernest Hemingway of coming up with titles for your artwork, because we wouldn't want it to become a stumbling block and a stopping point for you where you give up because you're not coming up with the right titles. Just keep working at it. It's a skill just like any other aspect of crafting and creating your work. And hopefully what you'd find is that your ability to come up with titles as you do it more and more evolves as well. We have done it. We always seem to do it, stumble right across the finish line for our time for these sessions. But Elizabeth, I want to thank you for joining us, letting us look at your work. It's just kind of fun. And I hope that all of you all, as we have these opportunities to look at each other's work, are following each other on social media, signing up for email lists so that we can keep track of each other and how the work is evolving and developing, and get to see more and more of that artwork come into play. So thank you, Elizabeth. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much. I really appreciated this. I love seeing everybody every week anyway, so this is great. Thank you.
Yeah, awesome. And thanks to everyone for joining us for the session again. Next week is going to be an Ask Me Anything session. And then we'll be back the week after that with more art. So stay tuned, be well, and we'll look forward to seeing you soon. Take care.